You're very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth on breakfornews.com with Vincent Dunn reporting. And we're going to take a look at our psychopath-possessed planet with Thomas P. Sheridan, who's the author of a book which you'll find on Amazon.com with a 5-star rating. It has those 5 stars because it's a great examination of the world of the psychopath, both at a personal level and at a social level. And it's called Puzzling People, the Labyrinth of the Psychopath. And if you put Puzzling People Labyrinth into Google, you'll get virtually every reference, including the website of Thomas Sheridan, who's on the line right now. You're very welcome, Thomas. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Fint, and thanks for having me on, and thank you for your very nice intro.
Well, I tell you, you have put together, Thomas, in that book, Puzzling People, the Labyrinth of the Psychopath, one of the most accessible and yet scientific examinations of the actual mechanisms of the psychopath. Not necessarily the Hollywood version of what a psycho is. Somebody with a chainsaw, dude? It's a little bit more subtle than that.
Well, I appreciate that because that was my modus operandi when I set out to write this book. Mm-hmm. Popular perceptions are generally quite wrong concerning what a psychopath is. I wanted to demystify all these misunderstandings and then present the science in a very matter-of-fact way. That some of it was quite complex science in such a way that it would make people realize that psychopaths are far more common in society, and they're not like Jason from Friday the 13th films. It's a very, very different thing. I came across this information and I found it very healing in my own life because I had been in the music industry. I worked in Wall Street and also had to deal with these individuals being bullied and stuff like that. And it gave me tremendous healing knowing that these people are, quite frankly, they're insane, but they hide their insanity behind a mask of sanity.
What sort of percentages are we talking about in the population, Thomas?
1 in every 25 in Western society. The American Journal of Psychiatry says 1 in 22. The European Union and the NHS in England, it's 1 in 30. So I rounded it off in the West for 1 in 25. So roughly 4% of the population.
That's a heck of a lot of them out there. And so I think what your book does very well is examine how they impact the lives of the people they come in contact with on a personal, person-to-person basis, and then also looking at the collective effect they have on society in general. And you show that really there's no hard and fast line. It's all one smooth continuum from the personal to the social with these people.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I also wrote the book. I wanted people to gain more from this than just saying, okay, my ex-husband was a psychopath or my former colleague at work was a psychopath. I want them to start looking further and saying, are the people who are running my country or my corporation, are they psychopaths? And this is the root cause of much of the misery and turmoil within society and around the world. And I didn't want to make that the general thrust of the book, but it kind of became that way towards the end. As I was writing this book, I was watching the Irish economy implode. And I could see that a pathological drive that existed among the great and good, quote unquote, it was almost mirroring what I was writing in the book about on a personal level. So it, as you said, there was a seamless transition from one to the other, and that's for a reason, because it should be a seamless transition. I want people to read this book and come away thinking that the world is a very different place than what they've been led to believe.
You know, there's a very good case that it's in the media right now, and it's perhaps a good place to start. And it's about a psychopath, he must be, because it describes the case in the Daily Telegraph on the 20th of May 2011. A headline, Malcolm Webster, polite charmer who lured women then plotted their deaths. To women, Malcolm Webster was affable, witty, always impeccably polite, and when his wife died in a car crash, police decided it was no more than an accident, but in reality he was a pathological liar and serial seducer, and the good manners were a mask for an insatiable appetite for wealth. He was convicted of murdering his wife 8 months after their wedding and attempting to kill his second bride in a plot to gain about $1 million in insurance payouts. He would drug his partner first and stage an accident with the car. He had petrol and newspapers in the back of the car to which to set fire to the car and burn his spouse to death and claim the insurance. And he had done it once already, and he had a failed second attempt. It's almost a classic case of a psychopath, but also a predator, which you've described in the book.
Yeah, a predatory consciousness. I was reading that case, and he ticked all the boxes. It wasn't funny. He had all the traits, you know, the no remorse for his actions, his invented personas to charm and manipulate people, and I'm sure he invoked pity in the second wife oh, my first wife, she died in a car crash. This is what they often do. They'll approach you with a sob story.
In fact, he was feigning leukemia. He was pretending. In fact, he'd gone so far as to shave his head completely and lose weight deliberately and self-injure in order to sustain this story he was spinning that he needed money because he was dying from leukemia.
Oh yeah, that's very common. They'll actually disappear and come back with a miracle cure. There was one young lady in Canada last year who raised an enormous amount of money for imaginary chemotherapy treatment or some special treatment. There's something like $400,000. She did it all using Facebook, and she got like celebrities in America and Canada to do benefits for her. All she did was shave her hair and eyebrows, lost weight, and told the whole world she was dying of cancer. And it's very common. It's very, very common. In fact, I think I know one psychopath in my own life who faked cancer, and it's only years later thinking back on it that I think that this is what this individual had actually done.
Yes,
and it's not uncommon. Faking illness is very, very common with these types.
Well, you're really charting the behavioural patterns of the psychopath in a way that we can spot the kind of head games which they're laying on other people. Pity, as you say, is one of them. Deliberately constructed illnesses. Inflated stories, I think. Crazy, bizarre background stories that are like James Bond stuff.
And wasn't it interesting how many Irish politicians suddenly became unwell or had problems as soon as the IMF came calling and stepped down from their position? I just found that I'm not implying anything, but, this is what you have to be like. You have to start thinking, are these people really sick or are they making it up? Because that's very, very common to do this. It's, they say prayer is the last refuge for a scoundrel, but I would say it's faking, it's getting pity and faking illness, things like that.
Yeah, well, you're pointing out that these behaviour patterns are applied by psychopaths both, say, at an interpersonal level with a sob story and loads of big promises, etc., and that the same kind of psychopathic behaviour is in the political domain.
Oh, yes, and planning their manipulation to the nth degree, covering all the angles. And most psychopaths are intellectually not very bright. They talk the talk. They'll be seen carrying the right book, making the right quotes from certain intellectuals, but it will not be the same thing as them having read the book. They'll be walking around with a Carl Sagan book, trying to pretend they're all scientific when all they've read is the captions under the photos or the inner flap, and that's very common. And you'll see that in politicians as well. They love to quote this, that, and the other, and talk about certain books. But I could guarantee you, many of them have never read these books. It's a very interesting facade of intellectual, prowess that they don't have. Making up for that, what they will have is a phenomenal, fantastical ability to construct and then implement the most incredibly complex, devious machinations in order to pull off a requirement that they need, or to target an individual or an agenda they want through. And it will be so well planned that the outcome will be almost an absolute certainty that they will get what they want, because they'll have covered all the angles. And usually if it does fail for them, it's usually because of an outside thing went wrong and derailed the plan. But their ability to plan is frightening. It's really, and this is why I bring up a lot in the book. We must be very careful these days with things like social networking and Facebook and putting all our personal history out there, because these people have an encyclopedic mind for reading another person's needs and wants and failings, and then implementing the perfect solution to this person's problems.
Right. Well, we've all got a cognizant sort of background consciousness to ourselves that's sitting behind the ego that observes everything. In this case, they are studying the behaviour of the prey with a reptile cunning. No wonder Ike goes on about reptilians.
I know.
It is like a reptile cunning.
I was thinking that too, actually, and he was talking about the reptilian brain, and I was like, well, that's it. They're psychopaths. That's how they operate. They're in that area of their brain, and this is how you can actually spot them. They're very. It's one of the most easy mental disorders to actually diagnose and verify, because a CAT scan test will give it to you like that. What they do is they show them photographs. They show a normal person images that elicit certain emotional responses, like a sunset or a puppy, and then the next image might be showing somebody being murdered, and a normal person and the brain lights up in the frontal cortex. It will light in very specific patterns. In a psychopath, their brains are constantly in a basically what is an alpha wave state, which is it's like a life sleep, and they will show no emotional change from a happy scene to a harrowing scene. So they're very easy to spot that way. Their brain processes are quite different than us. Now, we're talking in terms of consciousness now here. Yes, that's absolutely true. The underlying consciousness behind the ego is what is the real determining factor here. The more I study in this subject, and the amount of people who have written to me, and the amount of interesting discourse and dialogue I've had with both psychopaths and people who've worked in the field since the book came out, I have no doubt that it's the predatory consciousness lies behind their ego. Their ego is just a facade. It's in the case of a psychopath, an ego is a bespoke persona, basically, that's invented to manipulate people, places, or things. Now, the underlying consciousness within a psychopath, I think, is quite different than another human being. In fact, Dr. Robert Hare at the University of British Columbia calls them an interspecies predator, and I totally concur with that viewpoint. They're almost like a mutation or a subspecies within the human paradigm, which for some reason or other it seems to manipulate, feed, and prey upon us. There's probably an evolutionary impulse in this in terms of how we develop.
Yeah, I think you're right in that evolutionary focus, because we could look at this in one way as a war between the reptilian core of the human brain and the neocortical structure, the frontal cortex, the new thinking, empathic, Christ consciousness aspects that are emerging in the higher domains of the brain. So in evolutionary terms, we got to leave these guys behind. We got to defeat this entity, which we see mirrored in a way in movies coming out of Hollywood. And I was thinking in anticipation of this interview, Thomas, that many of our movie heroes are in fact psychopaths who routinely kill without a moment's thought in the movies that are presented to us. It's like as if these guys have taken over the propaganda of the planet, you know?
Yes, and this has been going on quite a long time. Usually in a pre-scientific age, it would have been expressed through folklore and allegory, through things like fairy tales and so on. Then the arrival of movies, you would have had it, and well, actually, it would have been really began with theatre. You would have seen the likes of Macbeth and, Lady Macbeth, sorry, and, other characters throughout fictional history.
Yes.
Bram Stoker's Dracula being a very, very prominent literary allegory for a psychopath, and that was based on the actor Henry Irving. And I've read his bio, and he absolutely was a psychopath in real life. So you can see where that concept came from in Bram Stoker's mind. But it's getting worse. I know it's here I am, my mid-40s. I'm supposed to say, oh, it was different when I was a kid. There wasn't so much violence on TV, but absolutely, I have to say there is. It's the role models specifically aimed at young people, and particularly women, are extremely psychopathic and extremely destructive to the feminine consciousness. And as you were saying, that in many ways this could be seen as a war between the reptilian complex of the brain against the frontal cortex.
Yeah.
But I can see, like, since the arrival of TV shows like Sex and the City, it's pretty horrific how women are now portrayed in popular media, and this is to basically dehumanize them.
An amoral consumerism, which is celebrated.
And it's sold under the guise of empowering women, which I find perverse too.
Okay, well, let's bring it back down to, because I'm conscious of this roller coaster we're going on here between the personal, interpersonal, and the social. Bringing it back down to the behavior of the psychopath in the individual relationship. You've so many great case stories in the book, puzzling people, the labyrinth of the psychopath. And one of them is about Kyle, who, Jesus, he seemed like a great guy, Kyle did. I mean, any woman would be glad to get a guy like Kyle at the beginning, before it all went horribly wrong. This guy kept up a facade for years. He studied plumbing, I think it was, to become gainfully employed, and seemed like the kind of dependable guy any woman would die for.
Yes, and he selected his target well. The woman in that particular case is she's a traditional and very compassionate, very good-natured woman. She had a good, stable employment within a government department, so there would always be an income. And he had the missing past history that they all have. He spent 19 years in Japan in the military, the U.S. military. He didn't collect his pension. So there we have all the unanswered questions that are in their pasts. And then as soon as he had got his qualifications, he suddenly went on what I call the psychopathic rampage. He was making up stories that he was a hitman for the Japanese mafia to cover his behaviors. It's just astounding. Now, what's particularly amazing about that case is that another woman who was involved with him has contacted me since, because she read my book. So this gives you, the chance of that happening must be millions to one, but it's not really when you think just how many people these guys and women are working on the sly. They can have literally a colossal number of victims and targets that they're working at all the same time, each one presented with a bespoke persona to manipulate that particular individual. That's a pretty incredible, the story of Kyle is pretty incredible, I have to say. But I actually have gotten ones that are even more astounding since the book came out.
Okay, well, I mean, without going into all the details, Kyle, maybe the stresses and strains of having to actually participate in that facade of getting a plumbing degree and the facade of being a decent guy, it eventually just breaks down and he goes into feeding mode. And this probably means, 10, 15 victims per psychopath is easily possible.
Easily. Yeah, and that's a very good point you brought up. Often when they meet periods of stress, this is when we discover what they are.
Well, we should examine as well the actual behaviour that is giveaway. There are giveaway signs. You talk about some of them, like eye movement being one of the signs.
Yes, they have. Well, that's not in all the cases. There's about 35 traits that they all have. They either have some of them or a few of them, but they'll have absolute traits that they all have. No remorse, using pity, strange or missing past histories, high levels of testosterone. On top of that, there'll be clusters. They can have clusters of secondary, or I call them relative traits. And one of them includes what you mentioned, the eye movements there. They're very interesting to observe their eye movements. Even if they don't have particularly what I would call that dead stare, if you make them angry, you will see that dead stare, and you will see what's looking back at you is not a human being. It's really bizarre. It's almost like the eyes have no soul behind them. The window of the soul. Well, there ain't no soul in them when you look at them. When they smile, another giveaway with their eyes is they won't have crow's feet. A lot of them wait into their 50s, especially the females, because when they smile, it's not like a normal person smiles, where our face, large numbers of muscles will be activated within our face. It's literally just a fake pretend smile. The mouth just goes up. The eyes don't smile with the mouth. And so a lack of crow's feet. Now, it could be you're dealing with plastic surgery or something, but that's a very common one to notice. The eyes have an interesting, almost like we're back to the reptilian thing, lizard-like scanning aspect to them. You could be in a room with one of them, and they're pretending to watch TV, and you will see these eyes when two other people may be talking in the room. The eyes will be literally scanning around, like it's really bizarre, like a gecko looking for a fly or a moth to reach out and grab at its tongue. It's very, very bizarre, and it's very, very unsettling and disturbing when you see it over a long period of time, because you know exactly what's going on behind those eyes. It's a predatory consciousness that's planning and manipulating, gathering data that will be eventually used for your possible destruction. So yes, the eyes are a very, very, very good marker of the pathology.
Well, yeah. Now taking it back out to the social, if we take on board the concepts of the collective consciousness, which is on the planet, well then, although these people have a sort of less developed and raw intelligence with great cunning, it's possible that as a collective they're exhibiting these traits. These are the people who are behind, well, much of the mess that we're in at the moment economically, and following the military disasters we've been sucked into, and the rampages of predatory capitalism. These people have a collective intent and purpose. However unconscious they may be of it, they're certainly acting to a collective intent.
Yes, I think even if they're not psychopathic themselves and they end up in this situation, you will have something what I've come to term a proto-psychopath, where it might be a normal person who would normally have empathic behaviors, but for one reason or another may end up exhibiting, psychopathic pathologies in their work life or in their political life. And I'd say that's quite common. But more disturbingly, you have, vested interests, these foundations and these organizations, like the Fabian Society and others like the round table groups. And they're actually sourcing at a very, very, very early stages psychopaths within to be actually used at later on, and they have an uncanny ability to spot them. They will spot them for future jobs as journalists. They will spot them for opinion makers as future jobs as politicians, and they tell them at a very, very early age, that you're going to be Prime Minister of England one day. You're going to be the senior, political editor for such and such newspaper, and this is quite frightening. And it's more accidental than planned. Mm-hmm. I'm not a great believer in this notion of a grand conspiracy. I think it's much more ad hoc than that. I think a lot of the time they want us to think that they're brilliant masterminds who are hidden in rooms. I think a lot of them are driven by impulse and compulsion to a far greater degree than a lot of the conspiracy theory people actually realize. And that should and if you do discover that makes it much more empowering as to how we can actually come to defeat these individuals, or better still, outwit them. Yeah, because there's a vested interest in all psychopaths have a vested interest in making you think that they're way more smarter than you.
Yeah. We see that, I think, in the ineffectuality of the bureaucracies which rule over us. They inherently have a stupidity built into it. But these people are present within the corporate world as well. So this is where we move down from the top power brokers to the sort of thing I saw in a recent video on YouTube documenting how one environmental agency was offering sponsorship participation to Lockheed Martin. And the environmental group was only too happy to take Lockheed Martin on as a client, essentially beefing up their environmental image, as long as you were prepared to shell out maybe $135,000 to the environmental group. So these are psychopaths negotiating with other psychopaths at a corporate level, and it's entirely amoral behaviour.
And it would be wrong to assume that this only takes place at the highest levels of corporate governance. There's an oxymoron for you. It goes on at the lower level too, like in things like government contracting and bidding and public and private partnerships. It's rampant there as well. During the Celtic Tiger years in Ireland, I saw that a lot. You could see the pathologies all over. The most repulsive form of grubby corruption, and there it was taking place with senior government, along with like small and large contractors. So, and that goes on everywhere, not just in Ireland. That's going on in every country. And as you said there's an inherent stupidity in all of it. And this is why so much goes wrong. They never seem to have all the angles covered. And I would agree that though it is the most dangerous and the most worrying is at the larger level. But it would be wrong to make the assumption that it's only taking place in Wall Street and in the high levels of government. Unfortunately, it's right down the pyramid, all the way down to the bottom of society.
Well, it is a pyramidical structure. One hopeful sign is that we are moving into a networked structure of equal peers rather than a pyramidical hierarchical control structure. So the tide of history is with us in terms of defeating these people. But your book also, Thomas, is a great guide for those who suspect. And I would say to people, if you suspect you're the victim of a male or female psychopath, check out that book, Puzzling People, Labyrinth of the Psychopath, because it will inform you as to the kind of behaviours you may have seen in your own life, and also will help you, and maybe you could address that, Thomas, as well, how to recover, how to chart your way out of this labyrinth and escape it forever.
Well, when people find themselves trapped in, the labyrinth of the psychopath, they've usually been gone in there through their ego, and this is where the domain this is where it's being fought. The psychopath targeted your ego with flattery and appealed to something within your ego to get you into this position. And I wrote the book so people could identify these things as they're developing and unfolding around them, as well as ones who've been through it or maybe worried about it going forward. Now, I would stress that even after you've read my book and you've seen my videos, I would hope that people would still try to make an emotionally neutral observation of individuals they suspect are psychopaths, because it's only too convenient for all of us to suddenly, point a finger at someone who's annoyed us or given us a hard time and says, oh, they're psychopaths or psychopaths. Sometimes just a jerk is just a jerk. Actually, most times a creep is just a creep. A psychopath is a very specific predator. They're not very common. There's plenty of them, but you should examine any potential diagnosis of these people very, very maturely and with, educated reflection, and not jump to any conclusions, because that was another reason I wrote the book, because that helps the psychopaths, because I know victims of psychopaths who've been genuinely damaged. Well, many people, understandably, in the early days of recovering from a psychopathic experience with a psychopath damaging them in their lives, have a tendency to point a finger at a lot of people and say, he's a psychopath, she's a psychopath. And this only helps the psychopaths, because before the relationship has ended or else you've been destroyed, the psychopath will have already implemented a smear campaign against the victim. So when the relationship ends, it'll be very easy for them to say, oh, they're mentally unstable. And if they're calling someone a psychopath, the psychopath can just turn around and say, oh, well, she calls everyone a psychopath. So there's a very specific way how to get through this experience without damaging yourself further, because some people end up socially isolated because of this problem. They have a fear of ever meeting people ever again. And the road to recovery is difficult. It's going to take a while. It usually takes about 2 years for complete and absolute recovery. To the point, from the early days, because you're basically dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Plus there's also a lot of issues with personal dignity having been violated. You will feel, there will be a feeling of almost like sexual abuse has happened, because you have been raped in a sense. You've been raped tiptoe style, little bit by little bit over time. There will often be horrific financial consequences for many people who've been robbed and manipulated and had their money stolen. But the good news is, and it brings us back to the evolutionary possibilities of this particular experience, that people at the end of it, and I get quite a lot of messages, when they've recovered, there's usually a stronger, better, a more psychologically more healthy person, and even in many, surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, a spiritually minded individual at the end of it, who's much better and much more aware of themselves and self-confident than they were prior to their actual encounter with the psychopath. If you process it correctly, it can actually be a wonderful experience at the end of the tunnel, at the end of the labyrinth.
Well, two things I found refreshing about your book is that one, you're talking about this way of looking at them, including not demonizing the psychopath, not starting to get emotional about this, and not victimizing them. This is just the way it is. But also, I mean, these people, it seems, may be actually playing an evolutionary purpose, in that our transcendence of these attacks among victims is producing, as you say, a more mature and spiritually enlightened individual who's a lot smarter than they used to be.
And it works on the social level as well. Many of the laws that we have today that protect people's, children, and other, vulnerable aspects of society have come directly out of psychopaths taking control of something. Things like slavery in the past, we have better, there's a more tolerant society today in terms of things like that.
Child abuse as well as a phenomenon,
especially in Ireland. The church did a great favor. Don't mean that they did a great favor molesting children, but they actually played a part in their own destruction. And the Vatican-appointed oligarchy in Ireland lost their tremendous power because of psychopathic individuals like Archbishop John McQuaid. And so that's the evolutionary aspect of psychopathology in action. And again, it's the encounter with these things, and I ultimately feel that this mass global awakening that's happening now, where people are finally wising up to things like how money is fake and everything. This is the result of that. If the psychopaths in charge didn't push their agenda too far and too fast, a lot of people would be still asleep and thinking that the world is everything that happens in politics or wars, they're all just accidental. They don't happen on purpose. You must thank the psychopaths in charge for that.
Yeah, I do. I thank them all the time for 9/11 because, and I've done a great many audios and a lot of research ever since 9/11. But, well, that woke me up in ways that I can't believe how dumb I was before 9/11. That was their own death warrant they signed, pulling off that number because it was a step too far and so many people are waking up as a result. Not that they were able to do anything about what happened on 9/11, but boy, are they waking up. Boy, did it get their attention.
The one that did it for me, and from a lot of people I know too, was the weapons of mass destruction, even very conservative people. Mm-hmm. The blatant lies that particularly Blair was spouting about that, and the incredible lengths they went to justify this invasion of Iraq for weapons that didn't exist. And then no apology. Do you remember that famous video where they showed Bush at a Republican fundraiser pretending to find the WMDs under his office and under his desk? I mean, at that point, something like 2,000 American troops had already been killed in Iraq. Yeah. And this is what we're talking about, their stupidity. Their stupidity always is their undoing in the end. And they get cocky. This is a thing with the psychopath who, as soon as it has a win or a score and it pulls off a scam, it has a tremendous rush. It's almost like, this is what actually I think ultimately drives them, because there's no other payoff really in it for them. Mm-hmm. They get a rush, a thrill, a charge, and this is when they generally trip up, because that's when that's when the mask comes off and you see the real predator underneath.
Yeah, we did. We saw it in that case. The case we were talking about, Malcolm Webster, who wanted to burn not one but two women. Talk about being dumb. But they did overextend themselves on 9/11. It produced this response, which is almost like a spiritual response in the population. But dude, here we are still, and they still rule. So we need practical, well-informed, scientific understanding of these people to defeat them as an intellectual exercise on behalf of the advanced culture on the planet that we represent, the new era. Part of our challenge is to defeat these people methodically, relentlessly.
Well, they always give you the weapons which you can use to ultimately defeat them, and what they've given the rest of us is this wonderful science of psychology. And we have about 100 years of peer-reviewed, cast-iron studies into what psychopathology is, how it works, and how it can be determined. Now, what's interesting, I can guarantee you, and I think it's already beginning, you're going to now see the science of psychopathology being discredited. Mm-hmm. And I put that in quotations, by the powers that be, as more and more people like me are writing books about them and making videos about them and pointing the finger and saying, uh-oh, look what's really running the show. Mm-hmm. So I do suspect the backlash will happen, and I think it already has. It has to a certain extent. John Ronson, the quote-unquote alternative journalist who writes for The Guardian and makes documentaries as Channel 4, has a new book out which basically is trying to restore the balance that, like, there's very few psychopaths out there. It's a very rare thing, and it's been overblown. And I haven't read the book yet, but there's a few snippets I've read of it. He seems to be already kind of targeting people like Robert Hare for the work that they've done. So it's interesting to see how the mainstream is now handling this subject after years of telling us there was only such things as serial killers and axe murderers. As soon as more people become aware that it's a far more complex and more impacting, they're discrediting it now. There'll be an agenda to try and shut this down. I have no doubt about it, but it won't work because the science is too well established.
Yeah, well, you're a great fan of David Hare. The book of his is Without Conscience: The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. He was definitely a pioneer in the field.
What was good about his work is he came up with the initial checklist, which is very good. Now, I do disagree with him on some things. A lot of the work he did tended to be on prisoners and jailbirds and those types, so I think I took that a little bit further. He also hasn't done much work into the field of female psychopaths. That still hasn't been fully addressed. There's still a bias towards the fact that only men seem to be viewed as psychopaths, but it's not true. There's just as many female psychopaths out there, and they're getting away with a lot more. But I do have a great admiration for his work. But again, I wanted to take a lot of that science, not just his, but some of the psychiatric papers, which actually is quite good, from the American Journal of Psychiatry, and then to put them in a very presentable format. And also I wanted, because I don't have any accreditation and I don't have a PhD and I'm not owned by any corporate or government research grants, I also wanted to take it to the next level and start pointing fingers at the top of the pyramid. And that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to get this stuff out there, is because it's time for us to all start looking to learn this stuff and then start looking at who's really running the show. And a college tenured professor would not be able to say that. In fact, in many of their books and writings, you often get the impression that they're biting their teeth. They're actually, they want to take it to the next level and start pointing at where the pathology really damages society the most. But ultimately, they're going to be pointing at their paymasters. So that's why I felt it was important that somebody who did not have the academic shackles could actually come out and give the full picture.
There's a very good chance that you could play a role. And just before we get off the issue of your coverage of this, if you go, folks, to YouTube and look for Thomas Sheridan Arts, then you'll get a whole rake of YouTube videos which address these issues very well. But I think you do stand a great chance of playing a role, sort of like Anthony Watt played in the climate change issue, where What's Up With That became the go-to place to understand global warming and the scam that global warming is. That in your ability to review existing material without bias, and also with an open mind and the internet at your disposal and a wide scope to your study, you can help to fine-tune our understanding of psychopaths and how they work at a practical level as well for the ordinary person.
Thank you, Fintan, for that very generous endorsement. But yes, I have to say I find the subject tremendously fascinating. It's as much as a hobby as anything else, and I think it becomes a hobby for many people to get interested in it too. But this stuff was just too good to be kept on their wraps, or worse still, fenced off away in the world of academia. It had to be brought out, and that's what it's all about. That's what puzzling people is all about. And
well,
I thank you for that.
I tell you, it's a page turner. This is a book which does not mire you in deep discussions of the different parts of the brain and the ego and the id and all the rest of this stuff. No, this is practical page-turning information that I think is very relevant to the individual who has been affected by a psychopath, for sure. And some of us may at some stage in our lives have come very close to, been potential victims, if not victims, of psychopaths. So cast your mind back, folks. But also, you're talking about the political and the social dimension to this as well. And so that makes it a real page-turner for me. And I couldn't stop reading it, dude. So you've done the business on this. Just put Puzzling People Labyrinth into Google and you'll get pretty much all of the links. Or, of course, you can go to the forum post on breakfornews.com that goes with this audio. But I'd like to thank Thomas Sheridan for joining us. Thanks, Thomas.
And thank you very much, Fintan, for having me on, and for you and your listeners listening to my message. Thank you. Okay.
All right, folks, that's it for this edition of The Beautiful Truth. I'll be back very soon with more, and I hope that you can join me for that. But in the meantime, for Break for News, this has been Fintan Dunn Report. Webster was affable, witty, always impeccably polite, and when his wife died in a car crash, police decided it was no more than an accident, but in reality he was a pathological liar and serial seducer, and the good manners were a mask for an insatiable appetite for wealth. He was convicted of murdering his wife 8 months after their wedding and attempting to kill his second bride in a plot to gain about $1 million in insurance payouts. He would drug his partner first and stage an accident with the car. He had petrol and newspapers in the back of the car to which to set fire to the car and burn his spouse to death and claim the insurance. And he had done it once already, and he had a failed second attempt. It's almost a classic case of a psychopath, but also a predator, which you've described in the book.
Yeah, a predatory consciousness. I was reading that case, and he ticked all the boxes. It wasn't funny. He had all the traits, the no remorse for his actions, his invented personas to charm and manipulate people. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he invoked pity in the second wife. My first wife, she died in a car crash. This is what they often do. They'll approach you with a sob story.
In fact, he was feigning leukemia. He was pretending. In fact, he'd gone so far as to shave his head completely and lose weight deliberately and self-injure in order to sustain this story he was spinning that he needed money because he was dying from leukemia.
Oh yeah, that's very common. They'll actually disappear and come back with a miracle cure. There was one young lady in Canada last year who raised an enormous amount of money for imaginary chemotherapy treatment or some special treatment. It's something like $400,000. She did it all using Facebook, and she got like celebrities in America and Canada to like do benefits for her. All she did was shave her hair and eyebrows, lost weight, and told the whole world she was dying of cancer. And well, it's very common. It's very, very common. In fact, I think I know one psychopath in my own life who faked cancer, and it's only years later thinking back on it that I think that this is what this individual had actually done.
Yes,
and it's not uncommon. Faking illness is very, very common with these types.
Well, you're really charting the behavioural patterns of the psychopath in a way that we can spot the kind of head games which they're laying on other people. Pity, as you say, is one of them. Deliberately constructed illnesses. Inflated stories, I think. All one smooth continuum from the personal to the social with these people.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I also wrote the book. I wanted people to gain more from this than just saying, okay, my ex-husband was a psychopath, or my former colleague at work was a psychopath. I want them to start looking further and saying, are the people who are running my country or my corporation, are they psychopaths? And this is the root cause of much of the misery and turmoil within society and around the world. And I didn't want to make that the general thrust of the book, but it kind of became that way towards the end. As I was writing this book, I was watching the Irish economy implode. And I could see that a pathological drive that existed among the great and good, quote unquote, it was almost mirroring what I was writing in the book about on a personal level. So it, as you said, there was a seamless transition from one to the other, and that's for a reason, because it should be a seamless transition. I want people to read this book and come away thinking that the world is a very different place than what they've been led to believe.
You know, there's a very good case that it's in the media right now, and it's perhaps a good place to start. And it's about a psychopath, he must be, because it describes the case in the Daily Telegraph on the 20th of May 2011. A headline, Malcolm Webster, polite charmer who lured women then plotted their deaths. To women, Malcolm Webster, you're very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth on breakfornews.com with Vincent Dunn reporting. And we're going to take a look at our psychopath-possessed planet with Thomas Sheridan, who's the author of a book which you'll find on Amazon.com with a 5-star rating. It has those 5 stars because it's a great examination of the world of the psychopath, both at a personal level and at a social level, and it's called Puzzling People, the Labyrinth of the Psychopath. And if you put Puzzling People Labyrinth into Google, you'll get virtually every reference, including the website of Thomas Sheridan, who's on the line right now. You're very welcome, Thomas. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Fintan. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for your very nice intro.
Well, I tell you have put together, Thomas, in that book, Puzzling People, the Labyrinth of the Psychopath, one of the most accessible and yet scientific examinations of the actual mechanisms of the psychopath. Not necessarily the Hollywood version of what a psycho is. Somebody with a chainsaw, eh, dude? It's a little bit more subtle than that.
Well, I appreciate that, because that was my modus operandi when I set out to write this book. Mm-hmm. Popular perceptions are generally quite wrong concerning what a psychopath is. I wanted to demystify all these misunderstandings and then present the science in a very matter-of-fact way. That some of it was quite complex science, in such a way that it would make people realize that psychopaths are far more common in society, and they're not like Jason from Friday the 13th films. It's a very, very different thing. I came across this information and I found it very healing in my own life, because I had been in the music industry, I worked in Wall Street, and also had to deal with these individuals being bullied and stuff like that. And it gave me tremendous healing, knowing that these people are, quite frankly, they're insane, but they hide their insanity behind a mask of sanity.
What sort of percentages are we talking about in the population, Thomas?
1 in every 25 in Western society. The American Journal of Psychiatry says 1 in 22. The European Union and the NHS in England, it's 1 in 30. So I rounded it off in the West for 1 in 25. So roughly 4% of the population.
That's a heck of a lot of them out there. And so I think what your book does very well is examine how they impact the lives of the people they come in contact with on a personal, person-to-person basis, and then also looking at the collective effect they have on society in general. And you show that really there's no hard and fast line. It's